Howdy! This screencast is to help you annotate Geraldine Brooks's speech, A Home in Fiction, for Module C, The Craft of Writing. It is expected that you've already read through the speech and have a holistic understanding of her purpose and vision. Now, Module C requires you to have an understanding of the aesthetics of language. So this means that you shouldn't be annotating for every little technique that you see, but instead you should be looking for patterns in her style of writing or features that are used predominantly by Brooks herself in writing this speech. So when you get to writing your own imaginative, discursive, or persuasive pieces, you can make links between how the prescribed authors use these features in their writing and how you have used these features in your own writing eventually. And that's how you end up creating your inspiration between the prescribed texts and how you use the prescribed text to inform your own work. All right, so just some mini context. Geraldine Brooks is an Australian-American journalist and novelist. She's worked for the Sydney Morning Herald and the Wall Street Journal, and she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2006. So she is a notable and credible writer who delivered this speech as part of the 2011 ABC Boyer Lecture Series. So that's this. The Boyer Lectures, in case you didn't know, is a series of talks by prominent Australians chosen by the ABC board to present ideas on major social, scientific, and cultural issues. So she's someone who, already a credible source. So when she's talking about this stuff called A Home in Fiction, we know that, she kind of means business. We know that she knows what she's talking about. Okay, on to annotating. All right, so I'm not going to go through every single word or every single thing, but kind of jump to where the specific annotations are, okay? All right, so let's find a color. Let's go with pink. Okay, first thing I think you need to understand is the title, A Home in Fiction. I think you can kind of build up some assumptions about what it's comparing to, but the specific word choice, a home, is something, safety, security, and then in fiction, which is kind of, obviously not our reality, something metaphysical, something made up. Okay, so I think what we can ascertain, from the opening title, is that she's trying to talk about how do we find our safety or how do we find our security, either as a writer or a reader, in the worlds of fiction. Okay, her opening remarks. A few years ago, on a crisp autumn day in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I attended a lecture entitled Singularities in Algebraic Plane Curves. Okay, she begins with an anecdote, right? She begins with an anecdote just here. She begins with this personal anecdote to establish familiarity and humility, particularly with her listeners. And then she weirdly gives us this lecture that she went to titled Singularities in Algebraic Plane Curves. Now, this is contrast, and it's hilariously fitting, I suppose, and subversive that a novelist is at a mathematics convention. So Brooks is attempting to connect to those listeners who may not be, who may not be lovers of literature, but she's making also that subvertive idea, that contrasting idea between maths and English, and how most people assume that they're not connected. But here she's trying to do that. For reasons I won't go into, it was necessary that I attend. I slumped into the room armed with a doodle pad. My plan was to sit politely and let the talk sail over my head. I would use the hour for meditative reverie. Perhaps, if I positioned myself wisely, a discreet little nap might be possible. All right, so she's giving us a little bit of humor, okay? That she's jumped into, she's a novelist or whatever, and she's jumped into this mathematics lecture and gives us some humor. She intertwines this with her anecdotes so that we kind of think that she's trustworthy, that she's credible. Also, again, kind of showing that humility. If you're willing to, provide some comedic relief on yourself or be able to laugh at yourself, it makes your readers a little bit more at ease, or in her case, the listeners more at ease. Continuing on. On the pad I carried that day, I have a few fragments of the sentences the mathematician used. A formal power series about the origin is an infinite sum. Homomorphism is an isomorphism if and only if the matrix is inevitable. Okay, well, I have no idea what that means, but she's giving us an exemplum here. So this example, so an exemplum is just an example, it's linked to her opening anecdote. It gives her audience a first-hand account of kind of like of her bewilderment. The fact that she doesn't really know what it means, but she can understand that the words themselves are kind of like poetry. They mean something. So here we get kind of this simile that she likens this idea about maths to English. Brooks connects maths and English seamlessly through her comparisons here. I thought and leaned forward to hear more. The mathematician was eloquent. She was passionate. And when I set aside my firm belief that I could not comprehend her, something strange happened. It wasn't that I understood her work, but I understood her vision. I realized I had lived until that moment in an airlock and that she was prizing open the heavy door just to crack. Okay, so this little part here, we get an analogy by Brooks, right? And an analogy is often used to kind of simplify overly complex things. And when she's talking about, this mathematics stuff, she's trying to relate to her audience. She compares her epiphany to that of an airlocked room. So she shares this common goal of trying to find out the truth in the same way that mathematics does. And what we can assume is that she's trying to find the truth in literature or in fiction. Okay. In the sudden brief shaft of light, I glimpsed a sliver of the world beyond, the world in which she lived. When she looked at the old maple beyond the lecture room window, at the great swoop bow arcing out from a massive trunk, her consciousness overlaid a pattern on that branch that was elegant and sensual. I could imagine for a moment what it was to see with her eyes, to feel with her heart, to inhabit a space in which the language was not particular and national, but infinite and universal. A world in which every object sang to her with its own particular music, chiming out in delicate arpeggios and thundering chords. All right, if you haven't picked up already, this stuff here is giving that kind of some beautiful metaphors and giving us this nice descriptive imagery, okay, of the way that the mathematician is looking out the window and imagining this. And then Brooks kind of inserts herself into it to describe it in such an eloquent way. It highlights her writing abilities and by immerses the reader into her realization. The metaphors of the music expose the beauty in this language. Even though she's talking about, the mathematician, we can see how she's intertwining her own skills as a writer to be able to describe this emotion and this feeling when you're looking out the window. I know now that it's a beautiful world, but I also know that I can't live there. If she has lungs, I have gills. I swim in a sea of words. They flow around me and through me, and by a process that is not fully clear to me, some delicate hidden membrane draws forth the stuff that is the necessary condition of my life. I am sure, though, that our work, the mathematicians and mine, is essentially the same. Okay. What she's providing for us here is again another metaphor. She's likening herself to the fish by saying, I have gills, I swim in a sea of words. That's a nice metaphor. And she's likening herself to the fish. And Brooks shows how lucky she is basically to uncover many truths in life and in fiction. She says she makes the comparison as well that she is no different than the mathematician in both searching for their own truth, their own reality. So we can see just kind of by her opening remarks, everything is quite well structured together, right? She gives us a nice little anecdote, then she makes these comparisons between mathematics, and she uses that to then make connections continuously throughout the speech. All right, we're going to jump further down to the bottom here. She gives us this. She talks about obviously the English words, etc., but she starts to bring herself in here. So I'm going to jump down to this part. But as a novelist, I'm glad to have immense cast of captains and chefs standing behind my chief, telling me that whoever she is in my novel, she trails a vast raft of history and association behind her, subtly framing her in my readers' minds before I have let her utter a single word. Okay. What she's referencing here is this idea of linguistics, right? Understanding the etymology or the roots or the origins of words. So Brooks, she appeals to ethos, and if you remember the rhetorical triangle of pathos, ethos, and logos, ethos is all about credibility, okay? So she appeals to ethos through paralleling the evolution of the English language to our interpretations of characters in literature. She mimics our imaginative abilities to paint stories and journeys when writing historical fiction. So Brooks herself is someone who does a lot of research into her own books, and she writes a fair bit of historical fiction using the realities of real stories, okay, or the realities of people's stories, to then craft and create her own. It gives it that kind of authentic voice. So in the way that she's talking about the linguistics here or the etymology of these words, she's really kind of giving us this idea about, her as a writer and what she can do with language and the way that she goes through crafting her own writing. All right, moving on. All right, Henry David Thoreau wrote that the youth gets together his materials to build a bridge to the moon, or perchance a palace or a temple on the earth, and at length the middle-aged man concludes to build a woodshed with them. Okay, so here we've got intertextuality. Brooks includes an example from her research into transcendentalism, because that's Henry David Thoreau wrote a lot about transcendentalism, and her connection with this philosophical ideology. She uses this humorously as she doesn't really agree with it. So she gives us this intertextual reference and then kind of, mimics it a little bit, makes fun of it to include that where man concludes to build a woodshed with them. Well, she gives us this. Well, it did not go that way for me. All right. So she's again kind of humbling herself in this instance to say, well, there are these beautiful ideologies out there, but this isn't exactly how it worked for me. Jumping down. But generally, my stories would be useful simply by offering an informative, entertaining read. Then they'd end up lining the floor of the budgie cage. Here we get some more humour, right? She admits humility and uses humour to discuss the complex nature of writing and how even her work as a notable author meant that she had to go through that entire planning, drafting, and refining process, right? Lining the floor of the budgie cage, literally, she's talking about how these mini budgies pooped on her work. Well, all right, she brings us back with a nice little anecdote. In my 20s, unexpected doors opened for me and my ambition enlarged a little bit. Okay, so she's bringing us back to her own world. She mirrors particularly how historians use research for understanding. She uses it to inform her own writing because she talks about her work being a foreign correspondent and the way that her life experience ended up shaping what she wrote about. Now, as a fiction writer, my ambition has slipped all reasonable bounds. Now, in middle age, I aspire to build that bridge to the moon. Like the mathematician, I am nothing less than eternal truths. What is this world? How can we more perfectly describe it? Who are we? Who have we been? Okay, well, she brings us back, okay, to the mathematician. So remember before we called it that kind of analogy that she's likening the mathematician's world to her own. So Brooks structurally comes back to her analogy of maths, okay, not maths married at first sight, but mathematics, for familiarity with her argument and to address her universal value of seeing or finding the truth within stories. She's got this accumulation as well of rhetorical questions here, and we assume that she's going to answer it, or if nonetheless, that she's showing us through the process of the questions that she has to ask before she puts pen to paper. All right. Of course, it's one thing to have ambition and another thing to have the means. But I know I have to do the best I can with the materials I have to hand. Materials that I started assembling from the time I became literate and continued to amass throughout my career in journalism and on into fiction. By now, the toolbox has grown quite heavy, and some of the first acquired implements continue to be the most useful of my craft. Okay, well, she's literally using this idea or this metaphor of a toolbox, okay? And a toolbox of writing skills that helps her and her listeners understand what she goes through in crafting her own work. Yeah. She talks about the tools as they are basically work as a metaphor for life experience and skills that she's probably learned at university, through talking to people, etc., and that she applies that to her own writing. She starts to give us back her own life story here. At Sydney University, I studied government and fine arts. A freshly minted Bachelor of Arts and Honours, I came to the newsroom of the Sydney Morning Herald tremendously well informed about the merits of fresco over tempera in Quattrocento painting and classical political theory from Plato to Hobbes. Well, I don't know what some of that is, but here she gives us this kind of humour again, and I suppose a little bit of hyperbole. So the hyperbole exists in the merits of fresco over tempera and quarter-century painting and classical political theory from Plato to Hobbes. She's talking about how she learnt to be well informed from this stuff, but once she got to Sydney Morning Herald and worked there, she didn't quite understand what all of that means. Think about the way that you guys grow your literary knowledge from year 7 to year 12. Okay, if you had to do year 7 again with the knowledge that you have gained now, God, you'd all be writing, 99.9s for your averages. But she's showing that kind of life experience, helps you in the long run. So she gives us this kind of sense of naivety to the world of journalism, which then relates back to her credibility, her appeal to ethos. Moving on, she gives us these funny little kind of personal anecdotes about how they sent her to the sports department to cover races and where she kind of evolved from there. But then she brings us back down here about her personal anecdotes. So she says, as much as I disliked that work, I acquired some useful and durable tools from it. Above all, I learned a respect for factual details, which is essential to fiction. That might seem odd. Why should a novelist need facts? Isn't fiction facts antonym? In this, I am advised by Leclerc de Buffon, a distinguished 18th century naturalist. Let us gather facts, he said, in order to have ideas. Well, in this part, like I said, she gives us her anecdotes, yeah? She continues the use of these personal anecdotes, and obviously they're embedded within her speech to intensify both her, like the understanding of herself and her relationship with the audience. Okay, if she's talking about herself, it allows the opportunity for the audience to feel more included and understand her role and her credibility as someone who can talk on this topic. So Brooks promotes the idea that fiction can be born from our experiences and our tales and what we learn from the world around us. She basically is saying that it's an attempt in seeking truth to reality, okay, or an attempt to seek truth about reality and humanity, understanding our motivations, our characters, our idiosyncrasies. Then she gives us this nice little hypophora, I think, because she poses this idea. She gives us another intertextual reference by Leclerc de Buffon, a distinguished 18th century naturalist, where he says, let us gather facts in order to have ideas. So for me, facts are first inspiration. So she's kind of presenting us with, this example of hypophora. She poses a question, or at least a question that someone else has asked, and then proceeds to answer it through an intertextual reference. She encourages the idea that facts inspire fiction and the premise for stories themselves. She kind of continues that idea in this little paragraph, but we're going to keep running on. You can see that each of her paragraphs as well link into the next. So, even the beginning of this paragraph here, I enjoy running down these facts. A nice little metaphor that she's giving, but we'll keep going on. I enjoy running down these facts. It's a bit like a quest sometimes, or a vast puzzle. How can I find out exactly what books a rural English minister in the mid-17th century would have had in the rectory library? What word would a mid-17th century midwife have used for fetus? What did Thoreau do when he wasn't contemplating the wilderness or spending the night in jail to protest slavery? In the case of the rectory library, I happened upon an academic who had just written a paper on that very topic. For the right mid-17th century word, I consulted the Oxford Historical Thesaurus of the English language to find that the word she would have used for fetus was shapeling. And I was amused and astonished to find out that the great New England wilderness sage earned his bread in the family pencil-making business and had used much of his time at Harvard to glean the secrets of variable hardness pencils. Well, I don't know about the end of it, but she asks a question up here, right? Well, she asks lots of questions. She asks a question about basically her process in research, okay? Because if she is going to use facts or use history as a way to shape her own writing and shape her fiction, then she's looking at how she has to remain authentic within her language. So she would go back to figure out, in a rural English minister's world in the mid-17th century, what word would they have used for fetus? Well, you can't just use fetus in that context because in that time, it was probably talked about and spoken about as a shapeling. So the technique here is hypophora, right? She asks a question and then she proceeds to answer it. So she outlines how she gets her inspiration through knowledge, research, and understanding history, as well as etymology, right? So the origins of language. We as listeners are taken through her mindset as she writes. Yeah, so if she's going to kind of make her writing authentic, if she's going to make it enjoyable, part of that is the research that's involved. Moving on. She comes back to the tools, okay, which you know is a metaphor that she used before about the tools of writing, okay. And then she talks about, again, some of the process. So can I jump down here? Writing may aspire to art, but it begins as craft. Words are stones and the book is a wall. You choose each stone with consideration. You place it with effort. Sometimes you find just the right stone, the right shape and heft for that difficult niche, and the effect is beautiful and satisfying. Your wall has gone up straight and true. Other days, you pick up one stone and then another, and none of them is right. You try it. It will not fit. Frustrated, you jam it in anyhow. Okay, so what she's giving us here is another really good analogy. Okay, the analogy of the craft or the process of writing. It's meant to simplify the complex nature of writing, refining, and producing historical fiction. She gives us this beautiful metaphor of like words are stones, the book is the wall, and the way that you craft and the way that you create this story has to be about fitting the pieces in the right place. The effect is unsightly, the balance precarious. You come back the next day and you cannot bear to look at it. You bring in the backhoe and knock it over. Well, she's using inclusive pronouns here, or at least direct address. She's talking to you as the listener, you as the writer, you as someone who's writing historical fiction as well. Okay, so Brooks includes and implicates her listeners into this analogy by directly addressing them. Moving on. She says, I learned to write fiction in stages. From daily newspaper reporting, I wrote a reporter's book, 9 Parts of Desire. I wrote a reporter's book. 9 Parts of Desire was a journalist's attempt to stand back from what I had learned in 6 years living among the women of Islam, to take all the shards of experience written up in haste, The stories walked away from under deadline pressure and go back with time to reinvestigate and consider. All right, well, we get a direct link to her world here, right? So we all know that she was a journalist and that she was a foreign correspondent. So she gives us again some more anecdotes and implicates herself within her own writing about how her experiences are as a foreign correspondent and where she lived, so among the women of Islam, as an appeal to ethos, right? That she is qualified to speak to her purpose concerning fiction and truth. She is someone who went and lived in this new type of experience and wrote about it in the best way she could. Obviously, paying homage and giving the right, dutiful respect to to the women in these stories. Moving on. She gives us a few more anecdotes. Okay, her second book that she talks about. My second book, Foreign Correspondence, was much more quirky and personal. It began as a memoir come travel adventure about my childhood pen friends and my adult quest to find them. Well, she continues these stories, right? An outline of significant events to explain the experience of writing and how well she used it. She says here, I can pinpoint the day I became a novelist. I can recall the moment with perfect clarity. Here we get that reflective kind of component, right? A very personal, reflective words on her humbling herself and her implicating herself in this story and what she's talking about. She gives us a nice little kind of account of her world, and how she used part of her research and how she used the people around her as a way to inform what she was writing about. She comes back down here to talk about her experience with the Wall Street Journal and also the really difficult uh, and trying times that she had to undergo. Yeah, that she had to undergo when working as a journalist. Okay. Okay, down the bottom here, she says, the questions nagged at me until I started hearing voices, or one voice. At least, the voice suggested in half a line from one of the EM minister's few surviving letters, written just after his wife had died of plague. In it, he mentions that his maid has survived and is attending to his needs. The brief mention was all there was of that maid in the historical record. There was nothing more of her to be found, not even a name. All right. All Brooks's novels, right, are inspired in this particular way. So inspired by the fact that she's kind of, reading and researching, and she finds perhaps a gap in the voices, okay, that are within history. She believes that by using history in writing, it becomes a truer reflection of the human experience. That you're giving that kind of attention and giving privilege to the voices that perhaps have been lost in history. She feels comfortable writing in this way. Hence, I think why the title of the speech comes back to calling a home in fiction. She goes on to say, yet her voice was very clear to me, and how she sounded told me who she was. Who she was told me how she would act, and that in turn set the plot of the novel in motion. So this is very character driven, right? You might be someone also who, in your creative writing, likes to kind of invent or craft a really good character that could be based off real life. Moving on. You can see she comes back to the voices down here. Yeah. So where do you go to hear their voices, to imagine how they might have expressed themselves? What issues might have occupied their minds? Well, sadly, you go to court. You would find her there in every era. Okay. Here she gives us hypophora again, right? Brooks answers her own question. It reflects what listeners might be asking of her work as well. Okay, so if people have these questions, where do you go to try and privilege these voices that are lost to history? Well, you go to the courts. right? You find them within the documents there, people that are either present but don't get to say anything. And that's what she continues on here. She says, accused of being a witch because she was poor and alone, or a scold, which meant she had been overheard criticizing a man in public. And if the English assizes or the Massachusetts Bay Colony's religious tribunals took down verbatim transcripts, you would be able to read what she had to say, and you will recognize her anger, her sense of injustice, her awareness that she, as a woman, is getting a crook deal. All right, I do really like this bit. She gives us lots of allusions here. Okay, we get an allusion to the Salem witch trials. People who did the crucible, you should know this. Um, she draws similarities to the silenced voices in history, right? She utilizes the enumeration of different accusations of women throughout history. So, like we said, those accused of being witchcraft, those who were in a court but unable to say anything. Um, and she also connects with her own journey and context through the Middle East with the Islamic women, right? We also think we get a very personal touch here, okay? You will recognize her. So that is drawing you as well as the reader and as the responder to a voice or a persona or a character or something that you really resonate or that really resonates with you, okay? That you engage with. And I think many of you did something like that for your Module C writing task. Okay, whether you wrote from Falstaff or Henry IV or Howe's perspective, whether you took on, a proof rock style character, or if you took on, a perspective from the Magi. I think many of you, we got you to kind of write a story that engages with something that really spoke and connected with you. And Brooks is trying to say the exact same thing. Moving on. All right, she comes here to finally finally give us like a very distinct connection back to the title of her speech, right? If one definition of home is a destination, then I have reached it at last. As a fiction writer who draws inspiration from the past and nourishes it with experience garnered as a foreign correspondent. Well, it's a metaphor. Brooks links back to her central comparison of finding a home in fiction as it connects with her purpose for writing. Then she gives us some great little, some more analogies down here. I really like this one. This is for all the tech people out there, right? She says, you try to clear the cache, but you can't. You can't drag and drop your memories into the void. She's giving us a nice or a really good analogy here, right? She's giving us these pop culture references that fits in with her approach to intertwine different areas and professions. So maths is what she was making a link to in the opening between maths and English. And now she's making a connection, between writing fiction and how you can't just kind of, you can't clear the memory. You can't just drag and drop all of them into one particular place. You have to sort through them. And the best way that, you can. All right, she gives us a nice little intertextual reference here. And then we get some more literary allusions as we read on. And if you're thinking, she's giving us more allusions and more intertextual references, well, you're correct in thinking that because, her as a writer, I think she really tries to play to her strengths here. So she's got, because he had told me he loved English books, I tried to bring him a copy of Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, thinking the story and the spare language would be accessible to him. The jailers would not allow it. I thought of that boy when Major Michael Maury, the U.S. Marine attorney for David Hicks, recounted how he had been barred from giving Hicks a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. He was talking about here how a particular inmate was refused books because you could learn from them. So this literary allusion, Brooks, use of the big literary names and text intertwines with the power of inspiration and the power of fiction. That just giving someone a really good book to read, um, you know, not only inspires and influences, but helps kind of develop new insights about our world. So she really is commenting on the power of storytelling. If you also don't know who Major Michael Maury or David Hicks are, you can just go Google them. It's an American reference. All right, moving on. We're on the very last bit, I think. Woo. Okay, I want to go to the last part. We get some more literary allusions here, some more intertextual references, but I want to focus on this part. So, in his 1936 classic for children, A Little History of the World, the Austrian author Ernst Hans Gombrich, excuse me, describes the business of writing about the past. It is, he says, like lighting a scrap of paper and dropping it into a bottomless well. As it falls and burns, it lights up the sides of the well in the same way that our memories light up the past. The deeper it falls, the less is illuminated. Living memory gives way to archives, archives to cave paintings to fossils, until the light goes out and everything is dark. I really like this bit as well. It's a brilliant analogy again, a brilliant way to describe Brooks's view on writing. So she gives us an analogy here. It supports her view on writing historical fiction, and using particular the past to create new stories. So this light analogy, right, like down within the well, it helps her illuminate, haha, no pun intended, parts of the past that have been hidden. I think the examples that she's given before, right, are the oppressed voice, so women who haven't been heard in history. And I really enjoy this kind of analogy here because we get this beautiful imagery of the fact that if you shine a light or if you send a light down this well, you get little fragments of parts that you can build together as a story. And last but not least, her final line. She talks about your grandmother, her grandmother, your grandmother's grandmother, grandmother, and already we are back several hundred years. Every one of them probably telling stories that started with some version of Once Upon a Time. Well, we get here Brooks is subverting the end of her speech as a reflection for the traditional opening line of a fairy tale, right? That Once Upon a Time fairy tale structure where we know generally contains morals and ethical lessons and things like that, but she subverts that by ending on this very first line of a story. We get that real circular structure in terms of the entire speech, as a way for her to kind of, end. Sorry, for a way for her to kind of continue on with the way that history formulates and creates fiction, and it just goes round and round in a circle like that. And the last little bits she talks about how much she loves history. Because of me, this is another piece of humor. Because of me, he travels the world. Because of him, I travel the past. Moral, if any, it's fun to sleep with foreigners, but be warned, this can change your life. Well, she ends with some humorous language, right? It's autobiographical. It leads to a funny, probably inappropriate moral, but oh well. She changes the tone of her speech now as she begins concluding her thoughts about home in fiction. This whole bit here, this is a nice analogy. So, and now as I make my home in literature, we get that direct link to her, to her title, in a particular genre of fiction that explores the places in the deep well that the burning paper has left illuminated. I think of that mathematician and her search for a more perfect description of the world's swoops and curves. What can I know, after all, that is true about these people who lived and died so long ago, lived and died, as Henry James asserts, with a consciousness different from ours, a consciousness formed when more than half the things that make our world did not yet exist for them. Well, she gives us an analogy and she continues this extended metaphor that she's used earlier, right? She links back to the mathematician. She also links back to, the paper going down the well and illuminating parts of the well. She connects back to all her analogies through the speech. She appeals to logos here by giving the speech its circular structure. And she's basically tracking her own argument. She's reinforcing her previous points that she made about history and she made about how it informs fiction. And the end. She brings us back to her world. But I believe that consciousness isn't shaped by things. You can move the furniture about as much as you like. The emotions of the people in the room will not change. Consciousness is shaped by fear and joy, hatred and tenderness. This is what I know. They loved as I love, and that is as good a starting point as any. Well, she reiterates here that it's storytelling and the shared consciousness of truth and emotions that ultimately connects readers, writers, and storytellers together. And that we really connect with characters that have something poignant, extreme, and different and unique to say. And that when we give their voices, when we privilege their voices and when we highlight those voices, they become a great starting point for any type of text. Okay, that's it for the annotation. Hopefully you followed along and got some good notes. Bye.